Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to see everybody here. I'm Jeremy Wolf, chair of the Psychonomics Governing Board for this year, and I get the honor of opening the festivities by, well, welcoming you, hoping that you have an excellent time, hoping that you tweet about your excellent time if you are so inclined, hoping that when you are back home, you keep Psychonomics in your mind and go visit the website, which you will discover, if you haven't already, is now full of ongoing news and blogs and things more than simply your membership dues request. It is an actual destination at this point. What we're doing this evening is giving some well-deserved early career awards, and then we'll have a keynote speaker, but I won't reveal his identity. That's somebody else's job. But what I would like to do now is invite the chair of the awards committee, Patty Reuter-Lorenz, to come up and award some awards.
So it is my privilege and honor as chair of the awards committee to present the Psychonomics Early Career Awards for 2014. These awards recognize 4 outstanding young scientists for their valuable contributions to psychological science within 10 years of earning their doctoral degree. The pool of candidates on the whole was excellent, and I want to thank their nominators and recognize the many fine nominees for their accomplishments and wish them continued success in their endeavors. And with the help of the awards committee, composed of Lynn Reeder, member of the governing board, Sian Bailak, the 2012 recipient of the Early Career Award, and society members Laura Novick and Lael Schooler, we've selected the 4 recipients who I will now introduce. The first recipient is Michael Jones of Indiana University, who is recognized for his contributions in the computational modeling of cognitive processes. Michael? Congratulations. The second recipient is Tanya Lombroso from the University of California at Berkeley, who is being recognized for her work on lifespan language and cognition. Tanya? Congratulations. Catherine Rawson, the third recipient, is at Kent State University and is recognized for her contributions to learning science and memory. The fourth recipient, Jessica Witt, from Colorado State University, is recognized for her contributions in the domain of perception and action. Jessica is receiving the Early Career Award that has been named after Steve Yantis, who passed away last June. Steve Yantis was a longtime member of the Psychonomic Society. He served on the Publications Committee, and he was the originator of the Early Career Awards for the Society. The governing board voted earlier this year to name this award after Steve to celebrate his many contributions to the field. And Jessica, we are proud to present you with the Steve Yantis Early Career Award.
Okay, I can feel the tension in the hall as you wonder who, in fact, will be giving the keynote tonight. And to relieve that tension, I would like to ask Andy Yololinas to come up and introduce him.
I didn't realize I was going to be a surprise as to who was going to get this. I guess with me here, it's sort of given away. I have to say, it's a really honor to be here to be introducing Larry Jacoby. Oh, sorry. For those of you who don't know, I was a graduate student in his lab in a couple years ago, maybe early 90s, I guess. A very exciting time at McMaster. During that time, Larry taught me many things, none of which I can tell you about right now. I'm sworn to secrecy, but there is something to do with bourbon involved in one of the important contributions that he's made to my academic career. I've always thought that Larry has been an incredibly influential scientist, but perhaps I'm not the most objective person to assess that. So how do we go about assessing the contribution of a scientist like Larry, who's kind of made such an impact on the field? Well, luckily, a few years ago, Jim Neely published a very nice paper where he tried to identify the most influential papers in our field. And he looked over the past half century, looking at the something like 85,000 papers that have been published in cognitive psychology journals, just the best journals we have. And what he tried to do was to try to identify the top 500 papers out of those 85,000. Now, how many people here have looked at that article before, would admit to that? A couple. How many people, first thing they did was look to see if their name was in that list? Okay, there's one other person in the crowd. I'll admit that the first thing I did, okay, Ioannidis, it can't be too hard to find. It was pretty hard to find. But it was a real eye-opening experience, because looking through this list of the top 500 made you realize that there were some really fundamentally important papers that have been published over these 50 years. But interestingly, you could very quickly get the feeling that, to have one hit in that list was really quite phenomenal. The sort of thing that many of us would just go to the faculty club and drink some bourbon afterward and pretty much call it a career. To have 4 or so papers that are these kind of citation classics is really phenomenal, and it really reduces the pool of individuals that you see. And these, I think, are the people who really consistently could put their finger on the kind of questions that the science wants to answer, and they consistently can do it over and over again. Now, if you look for Larry Jacoby's name in that list, what you'll find is that he has 7 publications in that list. And he's one of a very elite group of small handful of individuals in the past half century that have accomplished that. And that's the ability to really kind of move the field forward and consistently do that. So, I feel maybe I'll get lucky, I'll have a one-hit wonder somewhere, but Larry just consistently can produce those sorts of papers over and over again. Now, well, citations aren't everything, okay? It's a pretty good start, I'd say. I'd be pretty happy with that. But there are other ways you can assess somebody's success, and that is to just talk to your colleagues and ask, well, what's Larry known for? What are the major contributions? What kind of a scientist is he? And this is not my sample size was kind of small, so I wouldn't want to publish this, but asking colleagues, I found a very consistent list of kind of character descriptions and ideas about what the major contributions that really stuck in people's minds. There's a couple I really like. One theme that keeps coming up again, things like he's a real maverick thinker. He's not afraid to blaze new trails, and a lot of these sort of cowboy images. I've never actually seen Larry wearing a cowboy hat, but I could imagine that. Okay, it is certainly true Larry's not afraid to make bold theoretical statements and piss off a lot of people sometimes. Okay, he will make these statements, and there are many cases where he moves the field forward, and there are many cases where people don't always agree, and there's always room for discussion about it. In fact, I think it's safe to say that there have been a fair number of careers that have been made in great part by people criticizing some of the work that Larry's done, or finding boundary conditions for which some of his claims might hold true. Okay? But I think it's also safe to say there's probably even more careers that have been based on people building on Larry's work, okay? Taking it in new directions, taking it into new domains, and leading to new discoveries. And hopefully, history will kind of describe me as being amongst that group. I'd be happy if that were true. Okay. So just to mention some of the kinds of influential pieces that Larry's been involved with over the years. Certainly in the 80s, Larry's work was at the forefront of the study of unconscious influences. Now, unconscious has been around for a long time in psychology, but it's been really difficult to develop tools to really harness those empirical questions that we want to answer. And Larry's work with indirect measures has been really fundamentally important in moving that forward. Okay. And then, of course, in the 90s, he developed an approach sometimes called the opposition logic or the process dissociation procedure. And in general, that approach was initially designed to sort of uncover the controlled and automatic contributions that are made to memory. But very quickly, Larry realized, and many other people, that this philosophy, or this framework could be applied very broadly to perception and memory and problem solving, social psychology, and now you're seeing an awful lot of it in the neurosciences as well. Okay. I think in retrospect, the logic underlying this approach might seem kind of simple, but I think with all great discoveries, that's the beauty of it. Once you discover it, it's simple. Okay. And I think that's the beauty of a lot of Larry's work. Now, luckily for us, Larry is showing no signs of letting up. He's been making important advances on a number of different research frontiers, to use the cowboy idea again. And hopefully he'll share a little bit of that work with us tonight. So with that, please help me welcome the mystery person, Larry Jacoby.
Looking at the size of the crowd, I need a drink. Thanks, Andy. It was really lucky on my part to have Andy as a student. A group at McMaster was a fantastic group. So a lot of the story I'm going to tell you tonight grows out of that group. I've been going to psychonomic meetings for over 40 years now. Isn't that boggling? I've really enjoyed psychonomics. I've learned a lot from it. I've made some good friends here. When I think back to earlier days when I first started going to psychonomics, at that point, I couldn't imagine being asked to give a talk like this someday. I couldn't even imagine getting tenure. I really appreciate the honor. As an indication of that appreciation, for those who know me and know me well, I want a tie. If I wear a tie, you know I really appreciated it. Okay, what I'm going to do today is, or tonight actually, is first off start off by talking about some of the older work, some of the work that Andy mentioned. One point I'm going to make in talking about that older work is that there really are some important advantages of placing automatic and controlled processes in opposition to one another. I'll argue that one advantage is that it potentially gives ways of developing better ways of diagnosing memory deficits, as well as points toward the treatment, ways you could treat them. After doing that, I'm going to move on to, and there's my little dual process man. After doing that, I'm going to move on to more recent work we've done. In that more recent work, I've become interested in noticing and recollection change and the importance of looking back. Not a lot of work's been done on noticing change, potentially an important area. In some cases, the first step toward adjustment to change is to notice a change. A point I'm going to make there is that, excuse me, is that it is an important area. It's also, surprisingly enough, related to automatic and controlled processes. That's been an obsession of mine. I said I've been doing 40 years going to psychonomics meeting. Well, for 30 years I've had that obsession with noticing recollection of change. Where that obsession came from in part, or at least where it started, was that, as most of you know, even very dense amnesics show evidence of memory when given an indirect test. Well, my interest in the contrast between automatic and controlled processes began with finding a dissociation like that in the performance of people with normal memory. A study that Andy mentioned was an old, gosh, this feels weird. A study that Andy mentioned was an early study, a study by Jacoby and Dallas. In that experiment, what we did was to use perceptual identification as an indirect measure of memory, as an indirect test of memory. If you were a participant in that experiment, it would look like this. You'd be told that there's going to be a word flash between these horizontal bars. What I want you to do is report the word that's been flashed. So it looked like this. Did you all see the word? Okay, in the real experiment, of course, the duration was much shorter than that. Also, the viewing conditions were much shorter, though. It's an indirect test in that it's not really necessary, perhaps, for you to remember having seen the word in order to have an effect on your later perceptual identification performance. Having earlier read the word in the experimental setting might make you better able to see the word when it's flashed, even though you don't recognize the word as being one you'd read earlier on. And in fact, that's the kind of pattern results we got. In the experiment, we used the levels of processing manipulation, much like Gus Craig had used, so that now that all the words were presented visually, people either answered a question about the physical characteristics of the word, the sound of the word, or the word's meaning. A direct test was a recognition memory test. For that test, not surprising, a large levels of processing effect. For the indirect test, in contrast, for the perceptual identification test, this is what we got. No effect of levels, even though there was a quite large effect of the prior presentation. Now, what that's showing is that, can you still hear me at this level? I'm talking at this level, great. I felt like I was shouting before and getting lots of feedback. Anyway, what one finds here is a large effect of the prior presentation. What it's showing you is that a particular prior experience can have a large impact on what you see later on. That's true even though you don't recognize the word as being a word you saw earlier in the experimental setting. So notice here that the effects is as large for those words that they didn't recognize as it is for the words they did recognize. The effect's not a simple priming effect. It's not a short-term priming kind of an effect. It's a very long-lasting effect. If people read the words on the Monday, they still show an advantage of perceptual identification on the Friday. It's also modality specific. Reading the word produces a large effect. Hearing the word produces almost no effect. It's also context specific. We did do some experiments that showed the context specificity. However, we never got the effect as big as we wanted it. We never got rid of it. I think the problem there was that our manipulation of context wasn't powerful enough. There always an experiment. And being an experiment is a pretty powerful context, isn't it? Also, always the computer. I'm convinced that if we'd caught him in the pub and flashed the word, there would have been no effect. Unfortunately, I couldn't get anybody to give me a grant to try that. Okay, in terms of that effect, excuse me. In terms of that effect, when we talked to participants after the experiment, some of the participants told us that, of course, they were better able to identify some words than others. After all, some of the words stayed on the screen longer than did other words. Now, actually, they were all presented for the same amount of time. We followed that up, and what we found was that people were misattributing the fluency that came from prior presentation to a change in the perceptual stimulus. We also got the opposite misattribution. We did an experiment in recognition memory where we were varying visual clarity. And what we found was that new words that were presented in the clear were more likely to be mistakenly judged as being old. So now then in that case what you have is a change in the perceptual stimulus being misattributed to memory. We did lots of experiments of that sort, showing misattributions of various sorts. Those kinds of experiments are still popular, particularly among social psychologists. And I should probably confess that I'm a closet social psychologist. Actually, a lot of their questions are the same as our questions, but just they're using more interesting materials. Okay, after that first study, lots of other people also found dissociations that were similar, and it became a hot area of the sort, with lots of dissociations being shown. The way those results were described was in terms of that a direct test measures explicit memory, whereas an indirect test measures indirect test a one-to-one mapping. I not only didn't agree, I can't even say it. The reason I didn't agree was that one-to-one mapping implies that the tasks are process pure, and they very seldom are. Yeah, there we go. They're often contaminated. So that now then, and they're being potentially contaminated, causes problems for interpretation. An example of that is that some people found that older adults showed a deficit both on indirect test and on direct test. That might mean that there's a deficit in both the two types of memory. What it might also mean is that your indirect test is contaminated, that some people catch on and now they intentionally try to use memory. What we did was that instead of adopting the implicit-explicit distinction, adopt the distinction between automatic and cognitively controlled forms of memory. By doing so, we make contact with an older literature. The definitions we used were that, excuse me, I really do need a drink. Automatic influences of memory are described as being relatively fast, requiring neither capacity nor attention nor intent, and being largely preserved by special populations such as older adults. They're also context-specific. In contrast, cognitive controlled uses of memory are described as being slower, requiring attention, being reduced in special populations. Advantages can be gained by placing the two kinds of memory in opposition, the two kinds of processes in opposition, so that now then, for recollection would give rise to a correct response, whereas automatic influences would give rise to an error. The performance is going to depend upon the balance between the two, so that now then you could describe the probability of an error being 1 minus the probability of recollection times automatic influences. To give you an example of that, suppose you're asked, should you trust an amnesiac with the secret? Your first reaction might be, of course you should. After all, an amnesiac can't remember. Well, an amnesiac probably couldn't recollect if you told him to keep the secret. However, they'd be left with automatic influences. So now with this simple equation, if the amnesiac can't recollect, 1 minus r is of course 1, so it shows that the performance is totally reliant upon automatic influences. You might also expect your secret to be given away by other people, by a person with normal memory, if you made them respond very rapidly. So now then this list, this definition is really a shopping list of different kinds of manipulations you could use. Excuse me. In particular, you might expect that if the person was divided attention at the time of test, that would reduce recollection. The person would be more likely to also give away your secret. Well, that's what we showed in the FAME experiments. In the FAME experiments, in the first phase of the experiment, people read a list of names they were told are non-famous. How many of you have heard of Sebastian Weisdorf? Okay, this is my Sebastian Weisdorf story. Okay, having read the name Sebastian Weisdorf makes it seem familiar. It's being familiar makes you likely to mistakenly accept the name as being a famous one. That's the automatic influence. You were told that all the names in the prior list were non-famous. If you can now then recollect the name as being one you read earlier, you can be sure that it's non-famous. If we look at the full divided attention condition, or the full attention condition, what we find is that people are less likely to call old non-famous names famous than they are new non-famous names. In contrast, if you look at the divided attention condition, precisely the opposite. Okay, so now that's fit well by that simple little equation, that a manipulation that reduces recollection makes automatic influences more likely to be shown. You get the same kind of result if you make people respond rapidly. You also find that older adults are more likely to show you false fame than are younger adults. What that suggests is that, should you trust your grandmother with a secret? Well, before you do so, it may not be a bad idea to give her the FAME test to diagnose her ability to recollect. That experiment led to lots of other experiments that made use of that procedure. One of the most clever ones, I think, is one done by Marzu Banaji, where what she found was that old male names were more likely to show false fame than were old female names. Now, if you show that result, you're in trouble. That's an implicit measure of sexism. Neat idea to use the opposition procedure, not just for memory, but also for prejudice. And of course, that was the start of the implicit attitude test that she developed with, what was that guy's name? Tony Greenwald, right? With, of course, that's had a large impact. I suspect there's a number of people in the audience that could tell this story for me, the returning to Winnipeg story. What the story has to do with is an older math professor who went away to a conference. At the end of the conference, he couldn't find his return airline ticket, stumbled around for a while, finally gave up, went to the airport and bought a new ticket. Took the flight home back to Winnipeg, called his wife, asked her to pick him up at the airport, with her responding that she would love to. There's really only one problem. They only had one car, and he drove it to the conference. Not good. I'm sure I flew here. Janine Hay and I, oh, excuse me, let me first do this. Look at the situation. The case here is precisely the same case I described for the FAME judgment experiment. Okay, recollection would lead you not to buy a return airline ticket. In contrast, having flown to most of the conferences, the person would be likely to buy the return airline ticket. So now then again, the probability of an error is 1 minus R times A. Okay, let's suppose that instead he'd flown to the conference. In that case, habit and recollection would be congruent. That means that either recollection would lead to the yes, and when recollection failed, he would still do so. Now, there's something very neat about those equations. If you subtract the incongruent errors from the congruent correct responses, you've got a measure of recollection. Having the measure of recollection, you can now solve for automatic influences. Janine Hay and I did an experiment that was meant to mimic that returning to Winnipeg story. What was done in that experiment was in the first phase, people were presented with pairs of words to learn, with the pairs being such that the left-hand member was shared, but with two different right-hand members. We varied the number of presentations such that the one pair was presented on 75% of the occasions, like organ music was presented 75% of the time. The training was extensive, and what 75% meant was 18 out of 24 presentations would be organ music. What that was meant to do is to mimic flying to most of the conferences. Okay, now in the second phase of the experiment, people were presented with the study list to be learned, and then tested by giving the left-hand member as a cue for recall the right-hand member. There were three kinds of study items. One kind of study item was a congruent item in which the typical pair was presented. Now then, in that case, you'd expect to find that the correct response could be given either because of recollection or when recollection failed because of automatic influences. Another kind of item was the incongruent item, and there, the probability of an error is, again, 1 minus recollection times the automatic influences. A third kind of item was a guessing item. For guessing items, neither pair appeared in the study list. It was, though, tested, and what people were told to do was to produce the first item that came to mind. Okay, that test is meant to function much like an indirect test of memory, but one that you expect to be largely uncontaminated. People have no real reason to rely upon recollection. Both the two responses are readily accessible. So what you'd expect to find would be that people would most often give the typical response. And they might even show you probability matching. Now what that lets us do is to look at performance of the older adults. We expected them to make fewer correct responses than did the young adults, and also to make more errors. That's going to give you a measure of recollection. And now lets you ask about automatic influences. Do the older adults differ only in recollection, or do they also differ in automatic influences? Now that third condition, that guessing condition is useful in that now then. That gives us a way of looking at our underlying assumptions. If our estimation procedure is a good one, you should get convergence between that measure of automatic influences coming from the guessing measure and the measure you got from using the calculations. Okay, here are the results. A large deficit in recollection for the older adults. What about automatic influences? Near dead on. What about performance on those guessing items? Again, near dead on, and very near probability matching. Notice that nice convergence between the two. Quite in line with what you'd expect if the equations are behaving well for you. We replicated that a number of times, including the convergence between the guessing items and the estimates of automatic influences. Other people also found similar dissociations using the same equations. One of my favorites there is one by Caldwell and Masson. What they did was found that older adults were less good at, less able to recollect where they'd last encountered an object, but didn't differ in terms of automatic influences. That's a nice result, and that in line with that result, some older people tend to forget where they last saw an object, like their car keys, for an example. Of course, there are large individual differences there. Well, that kind of result suggests that maybe you can predict whether a person is likely to forget where they last saw their car keys. It also suggests ways you might deal with the problem. One way you could deal with the problem would be to always leave your car keys in the same place, thereby taking advantage of automatic influences. Another way you might deal with the problem, that might be a better way, is to now then aim at recollection. See whether or not you can devise techniques that would allow you to increase the ability to recollect. Would be a better way, and that, of course, the danger of the first way is that, first off, inconvenient to have to always leave your car keys in the same place. Second, maybe it makes you inflexible in the same kind of way as you would be in the returning to Winnipeg story. Other people have found the same kind of dissociation using the same equations again for children and even for monkeys. Keith Payne, who's a student at Washington University, made use of a gun and tools task. Sorry, I'm drinking so much. What Keith found was that he may use the automatic influences estimate as a way of measuring prejudice. Again, social psychologists have made use of the same kind of procedures we're making use of for memory. Okay, what I've just shown you is an example of the process dissociation procedure. That paper, surprisingly enough, had 3,000 citations. It also feels like it's had 3,000 critics. The paper is based upon the assumption of recollection and automatic influences being independent of one another. What the critics have claimed is that it isn't, that they aren't, that they're dependent. In actuality, I never claimed they were always independent. What I claimed was that we could arrange situations such that they were independent. The data that I just showed you, those should convince you that you can get close at least, that nice convergence. And again, replicable. Also widely generalized. I mean, monkeys, kids, social psychologists, not bad anyway. Okay, in terms of, are they always independent? They definitely aren't. It's a variable relationship. Two ways you can think about cognitive control operating. One way would be that, and this is what a lot of people think about it, is it's an editor. A thing comes to mind, and now then if it's not suitable, you edit it out. That's the source monitoring kind of way of thinking about it. Another way you can think about it is that cognitive control operates at the front end to determine what comes to mind. To give you a clear example of it, to give you an example anyway, suppose you were prone to saying the F word. How do you keep from saying the F word to none? Well, by the source monitoring kind of approach, you're talking to the none, the F word comes to mind, and you say, no, don't say that. When I use that example with Catholic friends, their jaw usually drops. And what they'll say is that an F word would never come to mind if I'm in front of a nun. The one way it's a front-end kind of way, the other way it's a monitoring kind of way. With the front-end kind of way, if you're well situated, it doesn't come to mind. The only time it comes to mind is if you're not well situated, after having had a few drinks or something. In that case, the two are independent. In the other case, when it's an editor, they're not independent. There's a paper, I said before that, I keep looking for the screen back there. I said before that, Andy came into this story. We've got a paper relatively recently where we go through all this, talking back to the critics and so forth, as well as describing some new process dissociation procedures that have been developed since the earlier ones. Showing that, in fact, you can get the results to at least be sufficiently, the assumptions sufficiently met anyway to give you useful results. Another thing that's in that paper is some neural data that's in line with the independence assumption. Almost all, if not all, models have an independence assumption in it. That being the case, why did they pick on us? Well, there's a clear reason they picked on us. If I'd only been bright enough to have 20 parameters instead of the very simple ones I had, people would never caught me. They would have never noticed my independence assumption. Well, being simple has disadvantages. Complex models do have some advantages. I mean, there's some places where complex models are very useful. However, if you're interested in things like diagnosing deficits and training programs, you don't want a complex model. You want a couple of parameters that you can now then try to push those around. Simplicity has its disadvantages. It also has some strong advantages. In terms of its advantages, first off, in terms of diagnosis, useful to know how specific the deficit is. If there's a deficit in recollection, that would make you treat it differently than if you thought it was a more general deficit. Also useful in terms of designing procedures for training. A deficit in recollection, you'd aim at recollection and try to train recollection. Well, Janine Jennings has done some experiments of that sort. We developed a procedure that makes use of an opposition and shows promising results. I'll come back to something like that again later on. First off, Gus Craig, who's a good friend. Gus has heard my return to Winnipeg story a huge number of times. Gus tells the story of his being in Edinburgh, having flown there from, his being in I just screwed up the line. His being in Edinburgh and couldn't find his return airline ticket to Toronto, stopped mid-stride and asked himself, having remembered my story, did I drive here? You see our problem with that? I mean, pretty certain he didn't drive there. What it does illustrate is that recollection can have lots of different contents. A kind of content that we've been interested in recently is the importance of noticing recollection of change. Noticing recollection of change is important because, in fact, we do live in a changing world. If you doubt that, do a Google search. Rapid change can be very problematic. We saw that in some sense with the returning to Winnipeg story. Although there's been a lot of work looking at perceptual change and some large effects there, very little work done on looking at change when there's a long distance between the original and the changed response. There's good reason to think that change isn't noticed in that case in many instances. One thing that argues in that direction is a lot of times when people make contradictory statements, if the statements are wide enough spread, we don't notice the contradiction. That's even true for ourselves, that we don't notice the contradiction between statements we've made until somebody points it out to us. Well, one place you can find contradictions is in political debates. Here's an example. Romney, of course, originally, when he was governor of Massachusetts, instituted health care reform that's much like the Affordable Care Act that later on was instituted. So in that case, he was pro-health care reform. Later on, of course, he was anti-health care reform. In the old language of paired associate learning, what it would look like is this. The same stimulus in different responses, an A-B-A-D paradigm. So as compared to the control condition, what you'd expect is proactive interference. So that prior statement should hurt memory for the later statement. It's almost certain that that didn't happen. for most of you, what happens when I mention Romney and healthcare is the contradiction comes to mind immediately. Well, if the contradiction does come to mind, it's likely you show proactive facilitation, not proactive interference. To obtain that proactive facilitation, though, it's probably important that the person notice and recollect the change. Now, in this case, of course, you didn't have to notice. The press noticed for you and kept telling you about the change. What we did was to use a situation where we had a fictional debate between candidates, with now then in those fictional debates there being a number of different topics. For some of the topics, the two candidates had a consistent position across the two debates. That's the AB case. For other topics, the position was mentioned only in the second debate. And for the third kind of topic, the one we're most interested in, the position was changed between the two debates. Okay, in this experiment, what we predicted was that noticing and recollecting change would transform proactive interference into proactive facilitation. Where that prediction came from was our making use of prior work by Doug Hansman and by Aaron Benjamin, work on remindings. To notice change, you have to be reminded of the original event when the change event occurs. That means you have to retrieve that earlier event to notice the difference. Doing so, we argue, results in a recursive representation. In cartoon form, it looks like this. Okay, you hear the first position and store that in memory. Now, the second position is stated. If you notice the change, you now then represent both the change and the original event in memory in the form of a recursive representation. The recursive representation is important because that preserves the order of the two. If you know that AD reminded you of AB, it must be that AB occurred first, that it occurred earlier. Okay, if now at the time of test, you're able to recollect having earlier noticed the change, we'd expect to find proactive facilitation. In contrast, if you'd noticed but hadn't recollected, we'd expect to find proactive interference. Notice that's an opposition case again, depending upon recollection. Okay, if you're in the experiment, it would look like this. You'd be shown a picture of the candidate along with his position on an issue, and you'd be told to remember the position for that candidate. Now then you'd go through a second debate. For the second debate, the position would be changed for some items, stayed the same for other items, and so forth, that is, different issues. You'd again be told to remember the candidate's position on this issue. You'd also be told to, if you notice the position's been changed, press this key. That's our measure of detection of change. At the time of test, you're asked to recall the position held by the candidate, and then after you've tried to do so, you're asked whether or not the candidate changed their position across the two occasions, across the first and second debate, and that's our measure of recollection of change. What one finds is this. When change was detected and recollected, as compared to new items that occurred only in the second debate, you get proactive facilitation. When change is detected but not recollected, you get proactive interference. Opposite effect in the two cases. Isn't that pretty? Good. Okay, now then, in terms of that result, we get the same kind of result with word pairs as we do with the political materials. Chris Walheim's name in bold here, is in bold here. The reason for that is that Chris did most of the work in this notice and recollecting change line. He's also available for employment. In fact, you could really see the discussion of looking back and change as an advertisement for Chris that's aimed at his getting a job. So somebody hire Chris, okay? Interesting that we were able to get it with word pairs. One reason that's important is that with those political materials, there's an obvious relationship between the two positions. They both had to do with healthcare, for example. Okay, here, we've also gotten when there's no relationship between the two responses. So that now there's no normative association between the original response and the changed response. Another thing we found in those experiments, we've done quite a number of them now, is that huge individual differences. Some people are very good at noticing and recollecting change. Other people are very poor at it. And recollection of change is a strong predictor of subsequent cued recall performance. One reason that could be is that some people take a very narrow view. Other people take a much broader view. Like going back to the political debate case. Some people might be so locked into a current debate that they don't look back to the earlier debate, and consequently they don't notice the change. What we did was now bringing the noticing of change under task control. So what was done was to vary the distance between the original and the changed response, and to also manipulate instructions in a way that was meant to make people take either a narrow view or a broad view. What we expected to find there was that we predicted that we'd find direct evidence for the importance of looking back for noticing and recollection of change. If we did get that, that provides support for this individual difference interpretation. The other thing we predicted was that now then, given that getting that direct evidence is important, because now then we wouldn't have to rely upon conditionalized data. You'd be able to see it as direct evidence for us compared to having to conditionalize the data as I did in that earlier experiment to see the difference. Okay, here's the way the experiment was done. First phase, you're given a list of pairs to remember. Next, you engage in an intervening task, and what that intervening task is meant to do is to change the context between the first list and the second list. The second list is also presumed to be remembered. Notice that here that three kinds of items: control items that occur only in the second list, pairs that were changed where the responses changed within the list, and other pairs for which the response was changed between lists. Okay, that's the varying the distance back of the original and the changed item. During that second list, instructions were given that were meant to influence the looking back. For one condition, to encourage them to take a narrow view, they were told to press the key only if the change was made within list. Now, for that condition, perhaps they'll be locked in enough to that second list they won't even notice change that occurs between lists. For a second condition, they're encouraged to take a broad view. They're supposed to press the key as they notice change either within the list or between the two lists. Okay, now it's the time of test. They're given the left-hand member and asked to recall the right-hand member. What we're most interested, of course, is the between-list changes. What we expect to find is that proactive facilitation for the broad view condition, the all-back condition, but not for the narrow view condition, the within-list back condition. Here's what we found. Indeed, for the change between items, the all-back conditions show you proactive facilitation as compared to the control items. No difference for the control items between the two conditions. Also, no difference on the within-list changed items for the two conditions. Okay, do you see those? Did you get the, aren't those pretty? I mean, it really is showing you can bring that looking back under task control. We said it was because of you're controlling recollection of change. Well, here's recollection of change. Recollection of change is higher in the all-back condition than in the within-back condition. So now what those results are telling you is that you can bring looking back under control, under task control, and noticing recollection of change is important so far as subsequent recall goes. And you didn't have to conditionize the data. If you do conditionize the data, here's what you find. You'd find results much like the ones I described to you before. Proactive facilitation, when change is detected and recollected. Proactive interference, when change is detected but not recollected. If you look at errors, you find this, which of course shows exactly the same story. If change is detected but not recollected, high probability of an intrusion error. In the other case, very low probability of an intrusion error. So what I've showed you there is that noticing recollection of change transformed proactive interference into proactive facilitation, as predicted by a dual process model. Also, I've shown you that some support for that individual difference, where that individual difference is coming from, that it probably is a difference in terms of looking back. What I've talked about here is the importance of looking back to notice change. It's also important for other kinds of relationships. This is an advertisement for, I keep wanting to look at the screen behind me, but anyway, this is an advertisement for a poster that's going to be presented on Friday noon. What the results reported in that poster show is that even for a very well-learned pair, if you present that pair in a new context, no effect of the repetition if people don't notice the repetition. So even though it's presented a number of times in list 1, when you carry it across to list 2, if people don't notice that that pair has been repeated, it acts just like a new item. You get the same kind of thing for changed items. Although well learned in the first list, if you carry it over the second list with the response being changed, no effect if they don't notice that the pair has been presented in the first list. If they do notice the change, you get facilitation. So now the notice is important for learning as well as in this kinds of experiments I described for you earlier on. Another poster to advertise is this one. What that poster is talking about, or where that comes from, that line of research comes from, is that Mitch Summers, who's a colleague at Washington University, did research to look at the effect of training, trying to increase people's ability to make use of hearing aids as a result of training. So now then, what was done was 30 hours of training with the materials ranging from phonemes to natural discourse. After 30 hours of training, when he gave him the test, incredibly disappointing results. Almost no gain on any of his measures. Only one measure showed gain. And that was a measure that was essentially identical to the training measure, the training task. He asked people after the experiment, well actually prior to the experiment, he had them fill out a hearing questionnaire. After the experiment, he asked them to fill out the same questionnaire again. What he'd hoped to find, of course, was that even though his measures didn't show it, the people would think their hearing was better. 60% rated their hearing as being worse after training than before training. Almost all of them said that. I never knew how bad my hearing was before I was in your experiment. Isn't it surprising that they were unaware of the deficit? Probably some people that need hearing aids don't get hearing aids because they don't know their hearing's bad. How could they be that unaware? Well, our experiments give you an answer to that question. What's done in our experiments is that people are given context such as the plumber fixed A, and now then followed by a word that's presented in noise. And they're supposed to report the word presented in noise. Now, this is actually an opposition condition. An opposition condition being such that the context would predict sync. The sensory signal, in contrast, is drink. So now the response you'd give on the basis of context is different from the response you give on the basis of the sensory signal, making an opposition condition. Prior to our experiment, surprisingly enough, we were the first ones to ever use the opposition condition. Lots of research done looking in the congruent case, where now the context does predict the word being presented. And what was found in that case was that the aging difference was largely removed, leading to the conclusion by some people that older adults are more expert using context than our younger adults. By looking at the opposition condition, you might also find that they make lots more errors on the basis of context. That is, they might show you false hearing. What we found was that, indeed, they do make more errors. They're more likely to produce the word that was predicted than the one that was actually presented. And that's true even although you've got a softer noise for the older adults. We used a noise level that was such that for words out of context, no difference between the young and the elderly. Nonetheless, the elderly produced the false hearing much more often. The interesting thing is if you ask them for their confidence, when they do produce the expected word, the young adults will most often tell you they're guessing. The older adults, in contrast, would tell you they heard it. In fact, they'll tell you they heard it with 100% confidence. Makes a difference, doesn't it? If you're sure you heard it, you're now willing to act on it. That effect isn't just confined to the laboratory. Picking on my friend Gus again, Gus tells the story of that and his wife one weekend asking him, "Will you stain the shed this weekend?" Gus responded, "Stay in the shed? Why should I stay in the shed? I didn't do anything wrong." False hearing is probably a Rorschach test. Gus had probably done something wrong. Okay, Gus isn't the only one with this problem. In terms of diagnosis of deficit, some of us have had the unpleasant experience of having a spouse ask us, "Are you deaf or not listening?" If you're older, the correct answer to that question is almost certainly yes. Both are involved. If you now then look at tests that are used to test your hearing, they can't tell. The tests have only, some cases, sounds, phonemes, at most individual words. They don't have the opposition condition. Similarly, so far as vision. I took an eye test recently. Do you know they don't change the chart? They're individual letters. They tested my right eye, and now then tested my left eye. Being a wise ass, I said, same. They were the same letters they'd test with my right eye. Okay, that doesn't allow you to tell whether or not the person's not paying attention or whether, in fact, they're deaf. With regard to hearing, it's a nuisance. It can be embarrassing, or Gus wasn't embarrassed, but he should have been. Maybe not that tragic. Well, we find the same kind of results for false seeing, where now then the older adults are highly confident they saw something when that wasn't the opposition condition again. With false seeing, you can see how that could be very serious, can't you? Traffic accidents. Okay, of course there's large individual differences with regard to false hearing and false saying, just as there's large individual differences with regard to false memory. More recently, we've looked at the correlation between false hearing and false memory. By giving people a memory task in which we've got opposition items in it, also giving them the false hearing task, and looking at the correlation between the two. Here's what we get. The correlation for the opposition items equal to 0.51. Quite high. I mean, a lot of personality types, if they get a correlation of 0.2, they're excited. At 0.51, you're picking up 25% of the variance. What that means is that a lot of the variability isn't really due to hearing or seeing per se, or hearing and memory per se, it's cognitive control. Well, that gives you implications both for training and for diagnosis. So far as training goes, okay, and from both these cases, the important thing probably is that what the older adults aren't doing is disentangling themselves from the current context. And what I mean by that is that when I return to Winnipeg story, they're the person who's so captured by that current context that that's what was driving them. What he didn't do is disentangle himself from that to remember that he'd driven to the conference. Similarly, so far as the hearing, not disentangling the person, not disentangling from that context, so as to now then pay attention to the sensory signal. Okay, suppose you had the task of trying to train hearing, as Mitch did. Mitch didn't use opposition items. You might be tempted to believe that what I should really be doing is training people to not falsely hear. So I'll just use opposition items. That would be a bad idea. All of us depend upon context when we're here. I mean, context is incredibly supportive. It's incredibly useful, isn't it? Particularly when you're in a difficult hearing situation. So it's not that you'd want to teach the person not to rely upon context. What you'd want to do is teach the person when to rely upon context and when not to. You'd want to train their subjective experience and their cognitive control. The way you would do that is by using both congruent and incongruent items. That is, using the mix of the two, and what you'd be aimed at doing is not only trying to train memory per se, or trying to train hearing per se, but rather trying to train subjective experience and cognitive control at the same time. Excuse me. We've done one experiment of that sort. What we found was that after a short training session, that the older adults did diminish the amount of false hearing they showed you. Now that's encouraging. Although they did diminish it, it didn't go away by far. Even after a period of training, there was a substantial difference left. Okay, that's good news and bad news. Good news in the sense of that it means that it might be open to training. Also, in a sense, good news for us in that it's not just a failure to understand instructions. The bad news for us would be if we're getting excited about just older adults not understanding our instructions. That's clearly not the case. More generally, the same kind of training is likely to be useful for memory. So what we're planning on doing now is to do cross-training, having a period of time where you're being trained on memory, a mixture of opposition items and congruent items for a memory task. Now then in one case, following that with training on hearing, training on memory, training on hearing, and so forth, with what we'd hope to find is that now then by cross-training you get greater generalization. So the question is, can you now then train cognitive control in a way that will generalize across task? It should work. I hope it works. It'd be nice if it worked anyway. To end up, what I'm already arguing there is that a lot of times when people are talking about memory training, they're treating memory as if it were a muscle. So that now then if you just do enough practice, you're going to make that muscle stronger. Well, your takeaway message is that even for training muscles, you need opposition. Also, another part of that message is that you wouldn't really want to just try to train strength, you'd also want to try to train flexibility. And that's what we're saying here too, that we're trying to do with the cross-training, is not just try to train strength, but also try to train the flexibility. So here's a summary of the talk. First off, the advantage of a dual process model. Secondly, the importance of individual differences, useful for diagnosing deficits and also for training. So far as training, I've talked about treatment of deficits. I could have made the same arguments with regard to education as I've made with regard to training here for deficits. For education, sometimes information becomes encapsulated. You've all had cases where the student learned it in this course, doesn't transfer it at all to this course. Well, that's the same kind of thing we're worrying about here so far as deficits goes. Also, you could think about noticing the recollection of change as being a self-administered test. It is related to testing effects, isn't it? But now then you're self-testing as compared to having somebody else give you the test. Okay, so that's my story. At this point, you're supposed to list the people that contributed to the experiments and contributed to your career. There are too many of them to do that. Very nicely, they recently had a festschrift for me. I really appreciate the people that organized the festschrift and all the good friends and good scientists that came to it. And a good book came out of it. I'm supposed to tell you that that book's for sale in the lobby. If you tell them that I sent you, they're supposed to buy me a free drink for every book. I just made that up, but maybe they will. Anyway, it's a good book. I encourage you to have a look at it and think about buying it. Thanks for your time.
Three last words, or last sentences at least. First, I would like to thank you for that stimulating talk and give you this beautiful engraved airline ticket to Winnipeg.
Thank you.
Second, I would like to say that all of the members of the governing board have these attractive little tags on their name tag. So if you have comments, questions, suggestions about the meeting or about the society, I encourage you to find a suitably labeled individual and tell them. And finally, I would like to invite you all to enjoy the opening reception, which should be out there with many copies of a wonderful book on remembering, I hear. And have a wonderful evening. Thank you.